the rock stood up and turned around on, it spun on a dime on its back leg. It was unbelievable how quickly it responded, and came running towards us with his head down. And, we basically kind of froze to the spot pretty much behind a tree, and it went galloping past. And that told me several things, I think. And that was that, you can see a rhino in captivity, but you can never really know what a rhino is until you've seen it on your level. And you see the power and the magnificence that these animals have. But at the same time, I could see how threatened it was by our presence.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Let's create a cooler world. Welcome. Our guest today, Zoë Jewell, is the co-founder of WildTrack, a nonprofit wildlife research organization dedicated to the development of non-invasive and cost-effective means of monitoring endangered species. WildTrack's mission is to protect endangered species using a unique combination of advanced data analytics, artificial intelligence, and traditional ecological knowledge. WildTrack's award-winning footprint identification technology uses animal footprints to determine an animal's species, sex, and it can even identify individual animals. These data are made available for species protection and the mitigation of human-wildlife conflict. Zoë is an adjunct associate professor at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. She earned a master's degree in medical parasitology from the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene at London University, and she holds a degree in veterinary medicine from the University of Cambridge. Today, Zoë and WildTrack's co-founder, Sky Alibhai, continue to develop and apply WildTrack's non-invasive and objective censusing and monitoring techniques as a fundamental resource for wildlife conservation. So Zoë, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Scott.
So I'm hoping that to start off, you could tell us a little bit about WildTrack and what your organization does.
Sure. WildTrack is a non-profit. We're a 501c3. We're based in North Carolina. And we have a kind of unique mission, I think, in the conservation world, which is to protect endangered species, but using a very unique combination of advanced data analytics, artificial intelligence, and traditional ecological knowledge, which is very ancient technology. So really we're meshing the very ancient, tried and trusted technology that evolved over millennia with very, very modern, cutting-edge science to provide kind of a solution which is, I think, quite different and unusual in the way that we do conservation.
And when you're talking about this ancient knowledge, this ancient technology, this would be like indigenous trackers. So like hunters in Africa, let's say, who have been for generations and generations and thousands of years learning to track animals, for hunting purposes or other purposes, but you're incorporating that type of knowledge into the work that you do. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. The traditional ecological knowledge that I'm talking about evolved with humanity over a period of perhaps a couple of 100,000 years. And it was what allowed us as a species to avoid being hunted and to be able to hunt. And in other words, if you were able to decode signs on the ground, for example, and identify them as a lion, you would know not to track that animal, but rather move away from it. If, on the other hand, you were able to decode a sign for an antelope, you might want to go after that for a meal. And people, and there's obviously a lot more depth to traditional ecological knowledge. People who have these skills can identify which plants are safe to eat and how weather patterns are impacting their day-to-day lives, and all sorts of signs, sounds, smells, every sense you can imagine can decode something on the ground that's of importance. And that TK, sadly, is in decline today. A lot of traditional societies that hold it have much less use for it because they're no longer hunting, and nobody recognizes it as being of value, or very many people don't. Particularly, it's underestimated and underused in science. So one of the things we're trying to do at WildTrack is to rejuvenate and revive that knowledge and translate it for science so that it's acceptable to science. There's a very famous tracker in southern Africa called Louis Liebenberg who actually postulated that TK was the origin of science. It was how we started making observations, making deductions from those observations, changing our hypotheses, following a track in a different direction. These are all things that we do in science, and that have been really the foundation of TK. So it's a super important and valuable asset to conservation if we can deploy it effectively.
And for those who aren't familiar with that term TK, could you explain what that means?
Yes, TEK is traditional ecological knowledge.
And so the actual, what WildTrack is doing, and the name is very appropriate because I know some of the core work that you do is taking, for example, photographs of paw prints, of prints of these animals in the wild, and using those photographs, running that through software that actually allows you to identify the type of animal it is. And I also believe like the sex of the animal and even the individual animal. Is that correct?
That's right. When we started working with trackers many years ago in Zimbabwe, we were out in the field every day tracking rhino, and we were being engaged to track these rhino using satellite telemetry. And at the same time as we were tracking the rhinos with our satellite telemetry equipment, the scouts, the expert trackers that we were working with, used to kind of laugh at us and say, "Why are you doing this? You know, all the information is on the ground in front of you in the form of footprints." And, you know, initially we thought, oh, this must be some kind of witchcraft. I mean, we can see the footprints, but how could they possibly identify that it's a rhino and which rhino it is and the sex and the age of the rhino and all this information they would give us? We'd say, they must be making it up. But slowly, over the course of 10 years, we realized just how accurate they were. And began to think, you know, if we could do this too, if we could begin to use these footprints to get key data on where species are and where the individuals roam, that would be a massive asset for wildlife conservation. So that's how we came to footprints.
And when you're talking about the satellites, would that be like the like if we're watching a documentary and we see them putting like tracking collars on animals? Is that the kind of technology you were using earlier?
Yes, I mean, this was going back into the sort of mid-1990s, so things have improved a bit from now, at this point rather, but the basic collars that we were fitting were just simple radio telemetry collars then. Now you can use satellite collars as well. But not only did we move away from that because we found this source of footprints on the ground, which were everywhere and were much cheaper, of course, to collect than having to put a collar on an animal. But we found that the constant need to immobilize animals, to chase and chemically mobilize them to fit the collars, was having a negative impact on female fertility. So instead of producing calves every 2 or 3 years, the female rhino were producing a calf perhaps only once every 10 years, which was exactly the opposite of what we wanted to do. We wanted to protect them and try and grow the population. So that was a surprise for us. And made us think not only about using footprints, but in terms of using only non-invasive technologies. So now one of WildTrack's main missions is to only use techniques that don't disturb the natural behavior or ecology of the species we're trying to study. And in doing that, we ensure that the data that we're collecting from those animals represent their natural behavior and ecology. It's not possibly being skewed by any impact that an invasive technology might have on them.
I love that statement that all the information that you want is on the ground right in front of you. That's such a wonderful statement of the change that you all have made. So you're saying that it's not only healthier for the animals to use this identification technique that you're using now. You said it's cheaper too, because I guess all these tracking collars and other equipment that would be expensive. And are you able to collect more data this way and more useful data?
Yes, much, much more data. There's probably several orders of magnitude more footprints out there on the ground all over the world than there are animals. When you think about it, that's fairly obvious, I suppose. If you imagine a cheetah walking across the desert in Namibia, that cheetah might be able to cover even a couple of 100 miles in a day. You would probably get several tens of thousands of footprints. You could walk into the desert, and the chances are you might see a footprint. But if you went and walked into the desert to see if you could see that cheetah, you'd have a very slim chance. And so footprints, they're a great source of data. They're ubiquitous. They're cheap to collect. We have a smartphone. WildTrack has a dedicated smartphone app to collect them, to guide people through the process of collecting footprints. They're very cheap and easy to work with. And of course, one of the biggest pluses for us is that the people who have expertise in identifying footprints can be engaged in this process. Whereas if you're trying to radio collar something or tag it or dart it, that requires usually external experts to be brought into the field to do that work at great expense. So we believe that footprints are, one of the ways in the future that we can really revolutionize the way we do conservation science.
Yeah, and you're saying there's an app. So, and I was just looking at some of the information online, saw that there is a citizen science aspect to this where people can take photographs of these prints that they find and photograph them a certain way according to specifications that you provide, and then send those to you, and you're able to put those through your software and gather this data that you want about what type of animal it is and the sex and even the age or the individual animal. Is that correct?
That's right. So we're getting, we have two technologies that we use within our footprint identification technology, which is called FIT. And those two approaches within that technology are a statistical method, a morphometric approach, which we use in the software called JUMP, which is actually, JUMP is based here in the Research Triangle. And also we use an AI model, which we're developing at the moment, which will allow a much faster but possibly less accurate approach to processing a lot of data all at once. So we're hoping to combine those two, that we have all the raw footprint images feed into the AI model that will filter the data for us, and then JUMP will do a final decision-making classification at the top. And already we're getting accuracies of more than 90% in classifying species, individuals, sex, and age class, using either one or both of those technologies. And getting to your point about anyone can pick up these footprints, that's very true. We started really with a dedicated group of conservation biologists, professionals working with us in our WildTrack specialist group. And now our platform is beginning to recruit a whole range of citizen scientists, from ecotourists, recreational hikers, expert trackers, universities, other students, even school children, K-12 students, which is really exciting because it means we can actually expand our data collection globally. And I have this very wonderful vision of the whole world map being populated with little points where people have picked up footprints all over the globe. And sometimes using that citizen science approach, you actually pick up data from very unexpected places, which makes it even more valuable.
To get to the purpose of this, so I was looking at, I think it was an interview you did where you're talking about the importance of knowing where animals are and how many, so the numbers and distribution, and the important role that plays in conservation efforts.
Right. And
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, one of the biggest problems that we have in making any wildlife conservation decisions is that we have very sparse data on the numbers and distribution of endangered species. There are some areas in the world where we have a lot of data, and there are very many areas where we have very little or no data. If you look at the cheetah as an example, millions of dollars of funding have gone into cheetah conservation, and we have a lot of data from a few countries. But there are many countries where we have almost no data, and there are reports from time to time of cheetahs there, and we just don't know where they are. So being able to protect a species, to make a decision, how do we protect it? Where do we protect it? We have to know how many are out there and where they are to be able to make those decisions. And so, getting more data and bringing it in inexpensively and refreshing that data quickly on numbers and distribution are really key to making those effective conservation decisions.
So I'm curious about a little bit of the backstory. I know that you have a master's degree in medical parasitology from the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and you also have a veterinary degree from the University of Cambridge. I'm curious about the backstory even behind that, and when did you become interested in animals and conservation? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, I think I've always been interested in animals. I remember one of my earliest memories actually was visiting my grandfather, who was a furrier. His job was his profession was to make fur coats for rich people. And he used to go out to Siberia, go hunting and trading in things like snow leopard skins and bring them back to London and make fur coats. And in those days, and this is back in the 1940s, perhaps 50s, conservation really wasn't considered an issue. But I remember visiting him in his office in London when I was probably, 5 or 6. And I remember him picking me up and putting me on a big pile of furs. And I didn't know what they were. And I remember asking, what's this lovely soft thing that I'm sitting on? What is it? And I remember when he told me, I was horrified, absolutely horrified. I couldn't believe that somebody would skin an animal and make a coat out of it. Just couldn't believe it. And I think that memory stayed with me. I think I've always been interested in conservation since then. And I started my college career thinking zoology would be, a good degree to learn about animals. And I quickly realized that if I wanted to get into conservation, I'd need more than that. I did a master's in medical parasitology as a kind of preparation for a vet degree. And then I did my vet degree, and I trained to be vet and came out of it. And I thought, actually, this isn't quite what I expected it to be. And I felt that it wasn't getting me close enough to the conservation issues that I really wanted to work in. And again, even going back to that time, there was no real clear path to getting into conservation biology. It was a kind of, something you just kind of ended up in. And so I had an opportunity once I finished my vet degree to do a one-year sabbatical in Zimbabwe with my WildTrack co-founder, Sky Alibhai. And so I said, okay, well, I'll take a 1-year sabbatical, and it'll be interesting to see whether I might find a career in conservation biology, and then I can go back to working with the cows and the sheep and the cats and the dogs. And anyway, that was kind of the beginning of the end of the veterinary side, because I went off, or the two of us went off into Zimbabwe, and we started looking at rhinos and at footprints. And 2 years later, we said, okay, we're going to dedicate ourselves to this. So Sky, who had a nice, secure tenureship, teach at University of London, and I gave up my career, and off we went to look at footprints. So kind of crazy story, but I think it's been a very interesting path.
It's interesting, isn't it, to think about, because we often look at conservation work and we think about how much work there is to do, and how, people's attitudes really, there's so much room for change and growth. And yet when you think about it, it's really just almost within, in a lot of cases, like within one generation, within our lifetime, that so much of a shift has happened to where, animals were just considered to be here for our use, and how that thinking has changed so widely. Is that something that you maybe would agree with or feel, or I'm just curious about that?
Yeah, I agree with you, Scott. It's been a massive change. When you look back even 100 years to the way that people used to hunt. Look at the decline of the American buffalo herds, and look at stories like I've just relayed about my grandfather. There was really not all that much thought about conserving animals until perhaps the 1970s. And I think there's still a very long way to go. The problem is that most of our impacts in the environment are not really concerning to us until we see evidence almost on our front door. Probably the most frightening thing, I think, that we can see from data around the world that there are many species in trouble. But it seems to many people, it seems almost like a remote issue. It's not something that's happening outside. Climate change is another one. We can read about what's going to happen with sea level rise, but until the water is lapping up on your doorstep, it doesn't seem to become a reality. And I think the biggest challenge we face in addressing biodiversity loss and climate change loss is to somehow make what's happening seem real and even threatening to people, to begin to get people to say, we must do something now. And I think politicians will probably not act until the voice of the people is heard more clearly. And that's just, I don't know how we get around that. Perhaps we engage more human psychologists or sociologists, people who can advise on better ways to communicate these issues.
Yeah. And it's interesting, even at looking at numbers, I was looking at one, and this is, maybe from a few years ago, so I don't know if the numbers have changed, but you were mentioning cheetahs before, and estimated that there were over 100,000 cheetahs at one point, and now there may be as few as 7,000. I know that number is from a couple of years ago, but that number, when you really think about it, is so dramatic. And yet, like you're saying, it maybe doesn't have the impact on some people that would motivate people to really take action or change their views. I'm wondering if there's a story that you would be willing to share that really made an impact on you, and that if other people had been there with you seeing that, maybe that would make a difference. Is there anything like that you could share? You've always had this interest in conservation and an understanding of the importance, but something that you witnessed or saw or experienced that made you really understand that very real world, tangible impact, something that was almost like the water lapping on your front door that you mentioned earlier?
That's an interesting question. I think a lot of the work that we do at WildTrack, people come to us with problems generally. This is how we start working with different groups. And I think recently, perhaps within the last 5 years, quite a lot of groups are coming in with issues that do appear to be related to the change in the environment, change in the planet, rather than just interest in scientific knowledge. One of the projects that we're working with at the moment is a group doing monitoring the sex of turtles in the Amazon. These are river turtles. And they've been telling us that the sex of the hatchlings is now being impacted by climate change. I'll step back a second and explain this better. Turtle hatchling sex is generally impacted by the temperature of the nest in which the eggs are laid. Generally, before climate change was a major issue, there would be the local temperature would be the only factor impacting the hatchling sex, and that would be variable every year. Now it seems that many, many more nest sites are being impacted by climate change, and so there's a disproportionate number of hatchlings that are now appearing as female. In some cases, for example, in green turtles, 99% of hatchlings, newly hatched green sea turtles, are females, which is, of course, is a disaster for the species, right? It means that breeding, reproductive ability is going to take a dive. But I think, I can read that statistic, but when somebody comes to me and says, actually, we've got this problem and here's where it's happening, and now we need help to try and figure out how to identify hatchling sex more accurately so we can really monitor this problem, that kind of hit home to me in terms of, okay, this isn't just plain scientific monitoring, this is a real life impact that's being made by climate on these turtles. And it's urgent, right? A few years of having only one sex of sea turtle emerging is potentially disastrous for the whole species. So that's one example.
I think for a lot of people who are interested in animals, interested in conservation, who, appreciate the fact that we're sharing this world with a lot of other species and, those species have value and a right to exist. Talking about something like that, where this whole, species of sea turtles are endangered because of climate change, that has an impact. But there's a flip side of that. And I think this relates to something you were talking about earlier, where for some people, they're going to say, well, that's unfortunate that this species of turtles in the Amazon is going to disappear, but I've got bills to pay. I got to show up for work tomorrow, and it's not really impacting me. I'm wondering if there are examples that you might share that might bring that home for someone, where if we're not really careful about conserving these species and making sure that they survive, it is going to have a very real impact for humans. Are there any stories or facts along those lines that you might share?
Well, it's what you said is very true. That biodiversity is something we all absolutely depend on. I think the problem is that developed countries, which have the money to help, developing countries deal with biodiversity loss, we almost seem detached from biodiversity. We can't imagine that we could be dependent on biodiversity for our water. I mean, our water comes out of a tap and, there's never any problem with food or medicine I think the sad fact is that the people who are most impacted by biodiversity change or climate change are the people whose voices are least heard. And I think one thing we can do is to try and bring them to the table more effectively, bring their voices to the table, and bring their observations to the table. They are the people that are in contact with nature every day, and they will have endless examples of stories that they've seen which are like early warning signs, right? Biodiversity is the early warning sign for climate change because animals change their ranges, change their behavior because of climate change. In many cases, we're noticing this. But for the average person, these are all sort of rather ephemeral concepts, not related to their day-to-day going to work in the car, coming back in the evening and having supper. And so trying to make those voices heard, I think, is really key to success, key to getting politicians to change their views and understanding what we all have to do.
I'm wondering if you're seeing any change in that, because I'm thinking back about, like, let's say 30 years ago, and you might pick up a magazine and read about, endangered species in Africa, or you might watch a documentary on different species in South America. I'm talking about somebody living here in the U.S. But nowadays with social media, I mean, we talk about some of the problems with social media, but there is the opportunity for those messages and those voices to be heard a little more widely. I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that type of effect, or if that's not quite, kicking in the way we might hope it would.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a difficult question. I think I see a lot of that all the time. I mean, all my social media channels are full of that information because that's what I follow, that's what I'm interested in. But I think people who are not necessarily interested in this whole area are able to filter that out quite easily. And I think for people who are not quite decided, perhaps it's even an element of fatigue, hearing about what we must do for the climate. I think we could deploy a more effective communication, for example, by engaging with media stars, right, to help us convey that message. People who do have a big following, not scientists, but actual, movie stars and people who other people look up to, and they want to follow them. They want to follow their advice. They would be people to engage, to really try and help communicate what needs to be done. It's a real challenge for us. I mean, we have to be advocates for the work that we do, but at the same time, the general population are much more likely to listen to people they know in the media, I think, than scientists.
As we were talking earlier, that's what I was thinking, is there's such an opportunity there for some of these influencers and media stars, right, that get so much attention, have so many followers, an opportunity for them to do really impactful work by sharing this information or, influencing people's ideas about these things. I mean, I think about somebody like Steve Irwin, who not just famous, but so well loved and so much lasting power, such a legacy, like so many years now after his death, people still talk about Steve Irwin. People still know who he is. There's such an opportunity there for people who do have a large audience to be that, have that type of impact on people.
There really is. I mean, it's a huge opportunity, I think, for them to show their green credentials, show they care about the planet. Of course, it's a huge opportunity for scientists to be able to help convey those messages. I think one group that's done this very, very successfully is PETA, and other animal rights and animal welfare groups do that to great effect. They have engaged media stars, and they have great social media presence, and they have great communications. While scientists are pushing out long papers that people won't read unless they're academics. Sometimes our work gets translated for the media, but I think it's slow, and I think it could be much more effectively done with a wider engagement in society. No doubt about it.
Can you share the types of species, the types of animals that you are working with through WildTrack, and the types of species that you're helping to track and conserve?
Sure. We started with rhino back in the 1990s, and we published our work on footprint identification, and there were lots and lots of scientists who wrote to us and said, "Hey, could you do this for cheetah? Could you do it for jaguar? Could you do it for mountain lion?" And then we got outside the cats and the rhinos, and could we do it for polar bears? And we're doing it for a very wide range of species now. We have an AI site where we host our images, and I think we've got 40 species now on that platform, including most recently a whole range of tiny little mice. Small mammals, and we have a very innovative approach to collecting footprints from these tiny little mice. Their feet are too small to make a clear impression on most substrates, so we have a technique where we have a wooden plate which we put on the ground, and we cover the sort of middle part of it with shelf paper, kitchen shelf paper, which is upside down. When upside down, it's sticky. And we have a little bit of artist charcoal on each end. And as the animal, a little bit of bait, peanut butter, mice like peanut butter. And they'll walk across the charcoal, and then with their slightly charcoal-covered feet, they'll walk across the sticky paper, pick up a meal of peanut butter, walk across the other side, and off they go, leaving behind beautiful footprints. And we can identify different species from these footprints. And using that, we have a very cost-effective and non-invasive approach to monitoring biodiversity, because these little tiny mammals are great indicators of biodiversity change. Their numbers, because they're kind of like in the middle of the food pyramid, the sort of primary producers underneath them, and they're eaten by many, many carnivores above them. So as the environment changes, these little guys are impacted, and their numbers fluctuate up and down in a very sensitive, as a very sensitive measure to climate change. So anyway, getting back to your original question, everything from rhino down to tiny little mice. If it leaves a footprint, we can monitor it.
And it's interesting that you talk about these mice indicating, first of all, being impacted by climate change, but also indicating the health of the whole ecosystem, because, I think that's something that maybe people aren't always aware of when we talk about conserving certain species. It's not just because of those species themselves, but because certain species are indicated, because things are so interconnected. And these species that we talk about are indicative of the health of the whole environment they live in. And of course, we know that like Amazon rainforests are important because we depend on those for things like oxygen and, the health of the whole planet. So maybe that's just something to highlight and make sure anybody listening is aware of, is that is one of the reasons why it's so important to protect these species and conserve these species, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, mice and rats don't get great media attention. And if they do get media attention, it's not always favorable. But they are very, very important parts of the ecosystem. I mean, everything is. I mean, even think of, annoying bugs. Every bug has its place in the system. And think back 40 years ago, if you were driving along in a car, at any speed anywhere in the countryside, your windscreen would be absolutely covered with splattered bugs, your windshield. And now you can drive, probably do that same drive and you might not have any. So even when species are not visible, it doesn't mean that they're safe. And these insects are probably playing very, very important parts in the ecosystem that we might not even be aware of. So pretty much every form of life has its place and should be protected as part of the greater biodiversity.
That came up in a recent conversation with another guest, talking about conservation and the fact that there's so much that we know, but there's so much that we don't know yet, or that we've just learned recently. And, some of the reason for conserving these species is because we actually don't know all of the impacts they have and how they fit into this greater web of life that we depend on this planet, right?
That's right. I mean, I think there have been about 8 or 9 million species have been described. And there are estimates for the total number of species that are up to, another couple or 3 orders of magnitude greater than that. When you take into account all the microbial life, people, recently, I think it was a survey where they took a teaspoon of fluid from the rumen of a cow, from a cow's stomach, and analysed the microbial life in there. And they found, hundreds of thousands of new species in this one teaspoon. And so it's just that the sort of breadth and depth of biodiversity is so much greater than we're aware of at the moment. And all that supports humanity. That is there, and without it, we would have no fresh air, no clean water, no recycling, no medicines. It's basically we couldn't survive without it. So in as much as, climate change at the moment is getting a lot of the attention, biodiversity is equally or more important because that's the foundation on which everything depends. So we have to kind of try and tackle those two issues together.
I want to circle back to AI because, of course, AI is getting a huge amount of attention now with some of the generative AI and the tools that are available. Everyone's talking about it. But there is, more broadly AI technology that's been available and being utilized for a number of years. And I know WildTrack has done a lot of work in that area. So I'm wondering if you would share with listeners just a little bit of the background of how WildTrack and how your software has incorporated AI and some of the work that you've done in that area.
Yeah, sure. So the AI story is quite interesting, really. So just around about the time when the COVID pandemic struck and we couldn't travel, we were approached by a group from UC Berkeley in California who said, hey, have you tried looking at footprints with AI? It'd be kind of interesting. And we said, no, not really. We could look at it, but we're pretty skeptical that AI would be able to identify different species from their footprints, because when you think about it, a footprint is an imprint on a background that looks exactly the same as a footprint, right? It's like a mush in the sand. It's not like asking a machine to look at a face against a background or a dog against a background, which are very kind of clear-cut images. So we said, go ahead, we can help you, we'll look at it, but we don't think it'll work. And the very first trial we did was with looking at a set of lion footprints and trying to distinguish those from leopard footprints. And they were fairly small numbers of footprints, but put them through the system. And the AI team came back to us and said, perfect, we've got perfect separation. We said, we can't believe it. Sometimes lion and leopard are quite hard to tell apart. And then there was the whole, question about the machine knowing where the footprint was even. So we were astonished. And then they said, right, give us some more data. So we sent them some more lion and some more leopard from a different area. And the whole model broke down. And we said, so what's going on here? What's happening? And they said, well, we don't know. We can't really understand it. And I said, let's go back and have a look at the data. Use the human brain to have a look at the data and see if we can figure it out. And it turned out that the machine learning model was picking up on the color of the background substrate, not the object of interest, which was the footprint. And when we fed in more data that had a different color background, the model broke down. So this taught us something very important about AI, which is that it's only as effective as the data that you feed it. So it's quite possible to make a model, and the model is recording 100% accuracy, and you don't know exactly which features it's getting, that accuracy from. What's it looking at? We don't know. So we went back to the drawing board on that, started feeding more data, built up more varied data sets from different places. And then the accuracy actually did start to improve in a reliable fashion. And we're now working with AWS, Amazon Web Services, to build a new pipeline, which we think will be very robust to a lot of species data. Hopefully also give us the ability to look at sex and age and individuals. And I think it has a lot of potential. It will actually reduce the amount of work considerably. So instead of having to sort of manually put points onto an image, as we do with morphometrics, it can deal just with the images, and it can deal with images at different orientations, different colors, different backgrounds. So all that's good. But I think that we still have to be very cautious about the way we interpret those models to make sure that the AI is picking up on features are going to be important and are not irrelevant. And I think the other side is that we have to make sure that that technology is sustainable. So sustainability is everything. A lot of the time, AI models can be very expensive to run, very costly. And as a small nonprofit, we're running into this already, that we realize that this will be an expensive model to run in the future, whereas morphometrics is something, although it's slightly slower, we can do it ourselves. So it's a balancing act, I would say, but there's no doubt that AI eventually will help us greatly to reduce the workload and increase the volume of data we can process.
I think it's interesting talking to someone like you who has such hands-on experience working with AI and, relatively long-standing experience. I mean, you're talking about going back to 2020 and looking at some of the information online. 2020, you were working with UC Berkeley to design this AI-powered pipeline. 2021, you're working with Harvard University. So this goes back a little bit farther than a lot of us who've been playing around with ChatGPT. So you have this experience and this very in-depth technical experience working with AI. And all this is just kind of a preface to ask, like, a little more broadly, do you have any big concerns? Like, a lot of people are very concerned about the impacts that generative AI and these AI developments are going to have on society. How do you kind of feel about what's going on currently with all of that?
Yeah, I think it's like any kind of leap in technology that we experience as a society. I think that we just have to proceed with caution. I think that we mustn't write it off. I'm sure similar conversations were had when the printing press was developed. Is it safe to let people print all these letters, and print lots of books and have mass consumption, and probably the same questions with television and these sort of things. So I think it's clear that AI has a place. I think we do have to be careful with the ethics. We have to be very careful in how we filter and interpret the output of AI. And I think we have to be careful that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater in the sense we don't want to, or we want to make sure that the technologies that we already have, particularly non-invasive technologies, are not discarded in favor of what we perceive to be a superior AI opportunity. I think pretty well every technology that we use, so we use at WildTrack, we use a range of non-invasive technologies. Every single one has its place, and I think especially when you're doing a conservation study, the more different techniques that you can use, and we happen to focus on non-invasive, but the more different techniques you can use, the more robust your solution will be, the more confidence you can have in it, because you're not relying on any one particular approach. So I would say, yeah, AI is looking very encouraging. It's going to evolve a lot more in the next 10 years, I'm sure. And we just have to move along with it cautiously and understand that it's only as good as the data that we feed it. So it's really not intelligent per se. It's just a very good processor of data.
You mentioned the quality of data that's fed into it. And you also mentioned humans evaluating and analyzing the data. That seems like there will be opportunities for that for a long time for human experts in whatever field AI is being used. Like the need for human babysitters, the need for humans to sit there and look at this data and say, wait a minute, has this machine actually come up with something of value, or is this thing just making stuff up? That seems like there'll be opportunities for that for quite some time.
Very much so. And even now with the AI, one of the biggest kind of blockages we have in the pipeline is simply the need for humans to curate the data. When we first started, we thought, gosh, we'll never be able to produce enough data for the AI to kind of, really get up to speed with. And we found, particularly using drones, for example, we can collect a very large number of images very, very quickly. But the fact remains that somebody has to curate those data. They have to go through the data, make sure that they are what they've been labeled and that they're correctly oriented or whatever needs to be done for them to be able to go into the AI. And that actually takes a lot of time. That's where most of the hold-up is in many AI conservation models, is in simply getting those data curated by humans.
So shifting topics a little bit again, if you don't mind, like I said earlier, where people I think find stories very interesting, and I'm just wondering, with your just extensive experience in conservation work and traveling, if this is like taxing your memory a little bit, that's totally understandable. But I'm thinking, being someone who's been interested in conservation, and the first time you go to Africa, that must be such an amazing experience. I'm wondering if there's any story you'd like to share from that, or anything that stands out about like your first time going to Africa and being able to see these animals, or just being able to visit this area, this continent in person, actually being able to be there. Do you have any stories or any memories from that you'd like to share?
What struck me perhaps the first time seeing, for example, a wild rhino, when I first saw a wild black rhino, and I'd previously only seen them in zoos, and there's usually an enclosure with a kind of pit where it's far away in a field behind a fence. And I remember that kind of electrifying feeling of seeing this enormous animal, barely 30 meters away. We'd walked up towards it. This is when we were doing radio collaring. Walked up to this, what looked like a rock, and the guide that we were with said, "Look, there's a rhino behind the tree." We were kind of whispering, and I couldn't make it out. There was a lot of foliage, and I hadn't got my eye in, if you like, at that point. I'd learnt much faster after that to get my eye in. But the rock stood up and turned around on, it spun on a dime on its back leg. It was unbelievable how quickly it responded, and came running towards us with his head down. And, we basically kind of froze to the spot pretty much behind a tree, and it went galloping past. And that told me several things, I think. And that was that, you can see a rhino in captivity, but you can never really know what a rhino is until you've seen it on your level. And you see the power and the magnificence that these animals have. But at the same time, I could see how threatened it was by our presence in its habitat, and how easy it would have been for a hunter to come and shoot it, or a poacher to come and shoot it and take its horn off. And that made me feel very sad. And I think that was a point at which I realised just how vulnerable they are, even when they're coming at you with their horns down. It's an exhilarating but a sad feeling at the same time. And I think more and more over the last 30 years, I've felt that really the only hope for wildlife, for biodiversity, is for us to give it space, to protect it in its own natural surroundings, with no human disturbance, not even collecting footprints, just no human disturbance, as long as it's secure, as long as we can be sure that there's no poaching and it's safe, which at the moment we can't. But, wildlife has a way of bouncing back if it's left to get on with it, if it's allowed to. And it's very difficult to draw a balance between protecting and interfering, right? There are many difficult challenges, but I think that the first step of the process is to use non-invasive technology, so that at least we're definitely not causing harm to the animals that we're trying to study, and at the same time trying to put aside land and habitat to protect them, and make sure that they have space.
Wow, that's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So you talked about the early days where you're tracking these animals with satellites, and the trackers that you're working with are saying, why are you using all this technology? All the information that you need is right there on the ground. It must have taken a great deal of humility, or maybe I don't know. I'm just wondering if it was just like something that came on gradually, or if there was really like a turning point and a shift where you realized that using this traditional knowledge had such value. I'm just wondering, like, what was that process like? Was it like an aha light bulb moment, or was it just a slow realization that this traditional knowledge had value?
That's a really good question. I think we started off and we started working with these trackers, traditional trackers. We were skeptical because we thought there was so much promise in the radio tracking, radio telemetry. As we collected data and we saw the harm that the radio telemetry was doing to that population, that shifted us a bit. As we began to learn more about what the scouts were doing and talk to them, get to know them more, that shifted our perception a bit. But I think the real aha moment was when we were able to actually translate that TEK into scientific output in terms of classification of footprints. And that was possible really thanks to this software JUMP JMP that we were using, which is data visualization software, that enabled us to take those images and actually see for ourselves how they were classifying and see that the measurements or the features that the scouts had identified were in fact panning out to be the most reliable classifiers for the footprints. So it's like, wow, they said it was the length of the footprint, and here the software is telling us it's the length of the footprint, for example. And that was like, that was irrefutable. That's taking, the traditional knowledge into the scientific domain. So while, even before we'd done that, we thought, it does look like there's something here. Having that proof was really what sort of nailed it for us. And I think this is why we're interested, or have been interested all this time, but even more so now, in looking at other elements of this traditional knowledge that might also help enormously in identifying endangered species, or looking at elements of biodiversity or climate change, all these things that traditional knowledge can do. With the bridge to modern science, that can have a huge impact.
Yeah, so it's interesting. It sounds like there were three elements of that. There was an element of empathy, of seeing the impact on the animals. There was an element of connection where you talked about talking with these scouts and getting to know them as people, it sounds like. And then the hard evidence, right? The data, where you're seeing from a very practical standpoint that these traditional techniques had value, and kind of the combination of those three things led to where you are now.
That's exactly right, yeah.
Well, Zoë, thank you so much for sharing all this information, all these stories. There's a question that I usually ask people at the end of each of these episodes, and I'd like to ask you that same question. What is your dream right now?
My dream is to employ 100 people to push this to the point at which we can cover the world map in footprints and have those footprints inform on better conservation strategies. The alternative would be to somehow dream up, 100 hours in the day for me, but that's not going to happen. So, we want this technology to be used widely so that we can get lots and lots and lots of data, which is going to help transform how we protect endangered species, where they are, how we protect them. And above and beyond all that, I would love everybody to be more engaged in the process of protecting biodiversity in whatever they do, whether they consume less or they cycle to work or they recycle, or, all these things that we can do. That even if you only make a tiny contribution, it's an important contribution. And of course, I will say also that at WildTrack, we welcome volunteers across a wide range of skills, and of course, donations to help our work. And anything that any individual can do is, I think, a valuable step in the right direction. There are 8 billion of us on Earth now, so that's a lot of potential actions.
Yeah, I'm picturing that map, that world map on the wall, just full of pins from locations where people have collected prints, collected photos. And I'm curious about that. Is this something where you're mainly looking for people in specific areas, or this is something where literally anybody in any area of the world could potentially contribute?
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody, anywhere with a smartphone, even a camera, if they don't want to use a smartphone, they can pick up footprint images as they go about their daily business. Some people see footprint images on their car from a wild animal that's walked over the roof at night or whatever. Other people will have access to being out in the field, but anybody can collect this data. And we would love to see data come from unexpected places, as well as the places that people often go, whether you go on safari or you go to a wildlife reserve, or you happen to notice something in your backyard. There's interesting and valuable data everywhere, and that's really what I think is the beauty of footprints.
This sounds like it could be an interesting project, for example, for a school, a class in school, like a science class or something. Hint, hint, any science teachers who are listening to this.
Yeah, it would be fantastic. I mean, the great thing with kids that we found that, school children is that they're so curious and so observant, and at the same time, they're kind of wedded to their devices, right? So if you can combine an outdoor activity that requires a smartphone app, then you've kind of really got their attention. And they can learn through our app, they can learn how to track, they can learn about signs of footprints, and they can become citizen scientists of the future, right?
Yeah, it's a great opportunity. And where can people go to learn more about this? You have a website?
Yeah, we have a website, wildtrack.org, and all the information about our work is there. You can subscribe to our newsletter, you can join, you can find out more information. If you are part of a company that would like to be involved in helping support this work, perhaps with activities for employees or special events, or we've got a huge range of opportunities to be engaged, and we love having engagement.
All right, excellent. I'll be sure to share that link in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Scott.
As always, we have included some information for you in the show notes. You can find a link to the WildTrack website, wildtrack.org. You can sign up for their newsletter. You can make a donation if you'd like to do that. And we're also including a direct link to the page where you can read about their footprint identification technology. And there's a link there where you can download the app for your smartphone. You can get directly involved in the conservation work that they're doing by helping them collect animals' footprints. So right now, as we're getting ready to release this episode, it's December. The holidays are coming up. For a while now, my wife and I have had this tradition where instead of buying each other presents for Christmas or for our birthdays, we take that money and we donate it to a nonprofit organization. There are a number of organizations that my wife and I support, that we admire the work that they're doing. And this is just a cool way to support those organizations and support their work. And this Christmas, we are going to donate to WildTrack. So before we go any further, I want to make it clear, this is not some kind of paid endorsement. Zoe doesn't even know I'm doing this. This is a real life story about my wife and I and this thing we've been doing for a while now. I think this was actually my wife's idea. I think it was like the first Christmas after we started dating that we decided to do this, to, donate money to a nonprofit instead of buying each other presents. And it's been really fun. We really genuinely enjoy sitting down and deciding which organization we want to donate to and, making those donations together. It's fun and it feels good. Another advantage of doing this is, to be totally honest, we have so much stuff. We've got so much crap. I'm serious. And we're not super materialistic people, right? We don't have to have the newest iPhone every time one comes out. We don't buy a bigger, large screen TV every year so that we can sit and watch Home Shopping Network and buy more stuff, right? We're pretty thoughtful and intentional about the stuff that we buy. And we still have so much junk. I've been cleaning my office this week and I'm just looking at all this stuff and going, how did I get all this stuff? Maybe you can relate. So my wife and I both think that it's kind of nice when the holidays roll around for us to do something for each other that doesn't involve bringing more stuff into our house. And this isn't like some type of rule written in stone. Sometimes we do buy gifts for each other. Earlier this year, my wife's birthday was coming up, and I saw a pair of earrings made by this local artist that I thought she would really like. So I bought those for her and gave those to her as a birthday present. So we do sometimes buy gifts for each other. But the thing is, if we do buy gifts for each other, it's because we see something that we think the other person would really like, would really enjoy and appreciate. We're not just buying something for the other person because a certain date is coming up on the calendar and we feel like we have to buy something. My wife is not walking around the mall right now going, oh my gosh, what am I going to get Scott for Christmas? I have no idea what to get him. Usually in November, we'll just talk about this and say, hey, do you want to just, make donations again this year like we usually do? And we'll agree to do that. And the thing is that by doing it this way, the gifts that we do buy for each other end up being more meaningful. And when we do end up giving each other gifts, we end up enjoying giving those gifts and receiving them even more. So this is something to think about. Maybe this year, instead of buying material goods for each other as presents, maybe you and your significant other, or maybe you and some family members, will think about making a donation to WildTrack or to another organization that you want to support. Now, I don't want to start any fights here. I don't want to be getting an email from anybody saying, hey, I did that thing that you suggested, and I asked my wife if she wanted to make a donation to WildTrack instead of buying each other Christmas presents, and she got really mad and she's not talking to me anymore. Like, you got to know your audience, right? Before you suggest this to somebody, maybe think a little bit about how that person might react. What you can do if you like this idea, if you're like me and you like getting gifts, you always appreciate getting gifts, but you're also just as happy if you don't get any more stuff. And you really like the idea of donating to a nonprofit instead. Maybe tell other people that that's what you want for the holidays. That instead of buying you a gift, they can make a donation to WildTrack or to another organization that you want to support. Okay, I have one more quick story before we go. So a couple weeks ago, I was talking to my friend Lindsay, and she said, so Scott, what's up with your podcast? How come all your guests are guys? How come you haven't had any women on as guests? What's up with that? And it was a legitimate question because at that point, I had had several guests on the podcast already, and they were all men. The reason for that is actually kind of mundane. So I've asked a number of people to be guests on this podcast, including men and women. It just so happened that due to different people's schedules and availability to record, the first few people who were available to record episodes with me all happened to be men. And so after Zoe and I got done recording this episode, I was asking her about using a picture of her in the episode artwork and, which picture I could use. And she asked me if I would include a picture of Sky Alibhai, who is the co-founder of WildTrack. And Zoe said, I'm the one doing all the talking here. I'm the one who's going to be a guest on this episode, but Sky really deserves credit for all the work that he's done. So I would love it if you would, use a picture of him too in the episode artwork. And I thought that was like really kind and thoughtful of Zoe to ask me to do that. So of course I'm going to do it. So now I'm picturing like a week from now having a conversation with my friend Lindsay, and Lindsay going, Scott, what the heck is wrong with you? You finally have a woman as a guest on your podcast. And what do? You got to show a picture of her standing next to a guy. What is up with that? What is wrong with you? Lindsay, I swear it was Zoe's idea. She asked me to do it. She asked me to include a picture of Sky in the episode artwork. That's why that picture's there. All kidding aside, diversity, equity, inclusion are very, very important. There are many, many women who are doing important and interesting work in the fields of conservation and sustainability and climate science and climate education. And I'm looking forward to having conversations with some of those women and sharing those conversations with you here on this podcast. In the last podcast that I ran before starting this one, we had a great mix of men and women who agreed to join us as guests. And I am planning to do the exact same thing with this podcast, with Creating a Cooler World. All right. I know some of you have been waiting for the dog update. Here it is. So I mentioned earlier that I've been cleaning up my office, and my office has been a disaster. Like, talk about having too much junk. I have had, the classic piles of papers and boxes on the floor, and just, it's been a bit of a nightmare. So I've been cleaning that up this week. I'm very excited about it. I'm very excited about having my office cleaned up and organized. And it means that there will be plenty of room on the floor for the dogs to come in here and nap while I'm working, which I think they'll be very excited about. All right, folks, that's it. That's all I got this week. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Remember to give us a like, subscribe, maybe even leave a review if you would like to do that. And we definitely hope you will be back again with us for our next episode of Creating a Cooler World. Take care.